Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
According to his memory of the map, the end of the main road turned into an unpaved dirt road, and that dirt road had a sharp curve up ahead. If James were to go up in a straight line through the forest, he would reach the dirt road ahead of his opponents. For most riders, it wouldn't be easy going. There was a steep slope ahead, and there would be many obstacles along the trail through the trees. For James, that was nothing. The world-class racing skills he'd acquired could also be used for this type of motocross racing. Those skills, along with his super-sharp vision, allowed James to traverse the dense forest at nearly top speed. Still, as he sped up the narrow trail, he was swatted by low-hanging branches. Soon his bare arms were covered in fine cuts, and he felt burning pain. He wouldn't let that distract him. The pain was nothing compared to how worried he was about Cindy's safety. I wonder how she's doing, James thought, feeling profoundly concerned deep down in his heart. James drove his motorcycle to the top of the slope. Once he was on the other side of the hill, a dirt road about 10 feet wide opened up before him. He could already hear the buzzing sound of the other motorcycles in the distance. From the sound of it, they were rushing his direction at high speed. James laughed out loud, saying, "I made the right call. I totally believe in the lucky card given to me. Good luck is still with me even now." James laughed again and began to formulate his next plan. He steered the motorcycle to the side of the road. Then he found a place to crouch down. He was like a cheetah hunting in the night, quietly awaiting his prey. Though his driving skills were superior, this wasn't a normal race, and he couldn't win the competition using those skills alone. That was because his opponents had guns. So what James needed to do was snatch a gun from one of them. James knew how to use a gun. In fact, he was highly skilled. If he could grab one from an opponent, then he'd be able to play the game like a fish in water. It would only be a matter of time before victory was his. James sat crouched on high ground, facing the downward slope of the road. This position was almost conducive to launching an attack from above. Less than a minute after James set up the ambush, the group of motorcyclists, all wearing different helmets, were visible speeding toward him up the mountain road. James could hear them too, laughing and shouting to one another over the buzzing of their engines. "Some super player, right? Scared silly by a gunshot. Did we hit him? It's possible. Sent by a bullet to meet his maker." They kept laughing at James as they continued to climb the hill. In high spirits, two of the riders pulled their guns and shot wildly into the forest beside the road. Broken branches and leaves flew in all directions. What the motorcyclists didn't know was that James was waiting patiently for the right opportunity to make a move against them. Closer and closer they came, riding to the edge of death. James crouched quietly in the forest, watchful and waiting. As the motorcycles began to race past him, he held back. If he pounced on the first motorcyclist to reach him, it would attract the attention of the four riders behind him. They wouldn't hesitate to shoot, and James would likely be showered in gunfire. Waiting to pounce on the last rider presented the least amount of risk. James silently counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, when the fifth motorcycle rushed toward him, James moved like a hungry tiger, pouncing down from higher ground. The motorcycle was moving fast, but James had factored that speed into his calculations. His brain performed these calculations like a computer, precisely considering all factors, including his landing point. "Aye!" The rider was caught completely off guard. He screamed in terror as he was shoved off the motorcycle by James, who'd flown at him from the side of the road. Now both the rider and James were flying through the air. They tumbled down the slope on the other side of the road. James stopped his own fall with his feet, while the other rider slammed hard against a large tree trunk. James grabbed a tree branch, swung himself up, then let go and landed firmly in front of his opponent. Having lost its driver, the motorcycle sped uncontrollably into the forest and crashed against a boulder. The damage engine sputtered out. Suddenly, James heard the sound of the other motorcycle skidding to a stop just up the road. Gunfire blanketed the spot where moments earlier James had been crouched and waiting. The bullets hit branches and leaves, sending pieces of bark flying all the way down slope where James was now. But the bullets couldn't touch James because he was no longer up there. You, what happened? The rider James had attacked was struggling to get up from the forest floor. It looked to James that the man had been heavily injured when he'd slammed into the tree trunk. Trying to raise himself up, the man fell roughly back to the ground. He howled in pain. Then the crying abruptly stopped. Stopped when James brought down his foot and broke the man's neck in a single fierce stomp. Then James removed the gun from where it was still strapped to the dead man's back. He turned around and coldly walked back towards where he'd parked his own motorcycle. 007, 007, where the hell are you? James could hear the man's companions calling to him. But James didn't hear the other riders circling back to look for their teammate. They apparently didn't care that much. They only shouted a few more times from the distance. Receiving no response, they quickly drove on down the road. Their cold-blooded heartlessness made James realize the extreme evil was embedded inside their bones. Armed now with a gun, James got back on his motorcycle and resumed driving along the mountain road. Peering forward into the darkness, he grinned. He was officially in hunting mode. James remained calm and composed as he rode the motorcycle down the dirt road. Now that he had the gun, he wasn't in any hurry. His range of attack has just greatly increased. The gun he'd stolen off the dead rider was an AK-47 assault rifle. James knew that this firearm was reliable, easy to operate, and especially fierce. He'd already checked out how much ammunition remained. There were more than enough bullets for him to take out his 4 remaining opponents. According to his memory of the map, at the end of this dirt road, there was a hiking trail snaking down through the mountain. No matter how reckless his opponents were, they wouldn't be able to drive their motorcycles very fast down that trail. After all, no matter how crazy and evil they'd shown themselves to be, they all shared a common characteristic, a fear of death. James felt that as long as they still felt fear, everything would be fine. The motocross motorcycle sped along the uneven terrain, roughly bouncing and jostling. James could handle it. He was as steady as a rock, controlling the motorcycle as smoothly as if he were riding uneven pavement. In the blink of an eye, James arrived at the end of the road, which was at the peak of a steep slope. Where the road ended, a narrow walking trail began. It was windy and twisty and led straight down to the bottom of the slope. The angle seemed even steeper on this path than the previous trail, although the distance down was relatively short. At the bottom of the hill, there was an open valley. In the darkness and from so far away, James couldn't clearly make out what was down there, but it appeared to be a large farm. From his current vantage point at the top of the hill, James could see his opponents had nearly reached the open grassy area at the bottom of the hill. He estimated that their distance from him was about 500 yards, and the maximum range of the rifle in his hands fell short of that. James sighed. He realized that his opponents must have been scared out of their wits to traverse the winding pathway to the valley so quickly. If they could maneuver that fast down such a steep slope, then their ability to escape shouldn't be underestimated. James wasn't to be underestimated either. Despite the cover of darkness and the fact that they were effectively out of the rifle's range, the worst thing that could have happened to them was letting James catch up. James was so proficient with handling firearms that he was able to hold the rifle steady even as he navigated the motorcycle down the twisted pathway. Locking his eyes on the 4 opponents below, James steered with his left hand and raised the rifle in his right. The muzzle of the gun spat out a shocking tongue of flame, lighting up the dark night. The scorching bullet shot through the air, drawing a long line of fire in its wake, heading straight for the back of one of the opponents at the bottom of the hill. At that moment, James was the embodiment of Lord Hades, god of death. the greatest assassin in the world. At such a distance, James couldn't hear the sound of the bullet entering the man's body. He could only hear the sound of the man's motorcycle whizzing out of control. Seeing their colleague fall to the ground, the three remaining motorcyclists started shouting obscenities, clearly in a state of panic. "He's a maniac," one rider yelled. They drove their motorcycles forward in a desperate attempt to avoid the same fate as their teammate. From their hysterical screams, James could easily tell how terrified they were. His judgment had been right after all. His opponents' hearts were completely filled with the fear of death. They no longer felt the reckless abandon with which they'd started the game. Instead, they discovered that in this game, they could actually die. None of them had ever imagined that James could get a hold of one of their guns. Their opponent was proving to be simply too terrifying. James's skills seemed beyond extraordinary. They were magical. It was as if the Grim Reaper himself were playing the game against them. After firing the shot, James slung the gun across his back. Then he took the handlebars in both hands and rushed down the slope. Rather than continue along the winding path, he rushed down in a straight line. Firmly holding the handlebars, he navigated across the berms and dips and reached the foot of the mountain incredibly fast. The distance between himself and his remaining opponents closed in an instant. The three riders, already in shock after witnessing another one of their companions killed, watched in terror as James flew down the hill toward them. They were so scared that they started cursing again. James could hear them. Their voices were shaking in fear. James could imagine how frightened they must be. That didn't make James want to let them off easily. He felt that they deserved to suffer immense fear. Only by letting them experience that level of pain and suffering would they be forced to own up to the extreme capacity for evil that they demonstrated. James followed behind them at a leisurely pace. From time to time, he'd shoot towards them. This caused the nerves of the three riders ahead, who were already in an extreme state of panic, to tense up even further. They continued to ride forward, with James never far behind. After such prolonged periods of tense nerves and extreme anxiety, they'd feel their eyes glazing over and exhaustion setting in. But then another gunshot would ring out from behind them, instantly causing them to snap back to their senses, and a strong will to live would kick back in. What they didn't know was that their souls had been doomed to be sent straight to hell the moment they were targeted by James. At several points along the journey, the riders had simply wanted to quit the game and ride away, but each time they'd been forced back by James's bullets to stay en route. They continued onward under the extended threat from behind until finally, they'd nearly reached the finish line marked on the map. They had, in fact, been chased there by James. His opponents thought that they'd finally reached the light of dawn, when what truly awaited them was eternal darkness. 3 bullets, each carrying the power of evil salvation, tore through the void. 3 figures fell to the ground, unable to ever cross the finish line right in front of them. James could have killed them instantly if that had been his intention. Instead, he'd ensured that their energy would drain slowly. All they could do was watch James drive his motorcycle across the finish line while they bled to death in the grass. Under the starlight, James came back and picked up their guns, one by one, and then slung them across his own back. Without emotion, he turned from the dying men and continued forward. Up ahead, on the edge of the horizon, stood a hulking factory. In the darkness, it looked like a huge monster crouched on the ground. James had only taken a few steps on the other side of the finish line when his phone rang again. He didn't hesitate to answer the call. As soon as the call connected, James heard the clear sound of applause on the other end of the line. Then the familiar voice said, "Congratulations, my super player! I never expected there to be a player powerful enough to clear 3 stages in a row. You've really surprised me. To be honest, you've surprised me a little too much. Oh, but it's not quite time for us to celebrate with you over champagne. because you still have to face the final 2 levels." James was listening intently. The man continued, "The 4th stage of the game is called Minefield of Death. The rules are simple. If you're able to pass through the minefield in front of you and reach the factory you see in the distance, you'll have successfully completed stage 4. The man lowered his voice. "But I need to seriously warn you that as soon as you're destroyed by a bolt of lightning in the minefield, we will send your friend on her way, only without her 2 beautiful legs." The man suddenly laughed maniacally. Oh, I almost forgot to tell you. You've already entered the minefield of death. You're standing right in it." He laughed again. "My dear super player, I wish you a complete corpse." The call ended abruptly. James put away the phone, not panicking in the least. His physical condition was far superior to that of most people, and his 5 senses were also much stronger. He was especially keen at sensing hidden danger in his surroundings. His body had a built-in warning system, and he'd already suspected that there were perils all around him. So it was no surprise to hear that he'd already stepped into a minefield, and he barely reacted to the news. Still, the cold-hearted ruthlessness that the man on the phone displayed made the suppressed anger in James' heart flare up. During the last phase of the game, James had killed 5 men, and yet the man on the phone hadn't even mentioned them. It was difficult for James to believe that the members of the Black Bat Society could be so cruelly indifferent about the lost lives of their colleagues. James had to consider that if a group of people were so indifferent toward human life, could they be trusted to honestly follow the rules of their own game? Could they be counted on to hold up their end of the bargain and safely release Cindy if James did win the game? The answer to both of those questions was absolutely not. James realized that the only way the Black Bat Society could have earned such a formidable reputation among those in the underworld was if they'd created a false impression by greatly exaggerating their own powers. After all, in this game that they'd created, it was simply impossible for an ordinary person to pass through all of the checkpoints and reach the end. Unfortunately for the Black Bat Society, this time, they'd invited a quite extraordinary individual to play their game. James stepped forward in the darkness, walking with his body slightly bent, and with all 5 senses sharply attuned. He could pick up on any danger around him at all times, as if he were equipped with a peril detector. He was quick to detect any number of explosives buried just below the surface of the minefield. Avoiding those spots, James moved swiftly through the minefield. In the distance, he heard the wind blowing along the River Thames. Toward the beginning on the minefield, the explosives were few and widely scattered. The pattern struck James as unprofessional. James relied upon his keen senses to avoid them one by one. Continuing through the field, James didn't let his guard down. He knew very well that since the man on the phone called it the minefield of death, making it across would not be simple. Certainly, not as simple as it had first appeared to be at the beginning of the course with the widespread pattern. Later, just as James had predicted, it wasn't simple, not in the least. Inside the abandoned factory, watching on the multiple monitors, the golden-haired man in the vampire mask was amazed by James's calm demeanor as he traveled through the minefield at high speed. Behind his mask, the man's mind started to panic again. He suddenly turned to the 2 masked men beside him and asked, "Do you see this? This player's performance is incredible. You 2 need to go and make the arrangements. Let our people spice things up for him." The 2 men instantly nodded, then hurriedly left the room. Outside the factory, there were several more men wearing masks, but these men ranked lower in status in the Black Bat Society than those permitted inside the factory. Seeing the 2 senior-ranking men exit the main door of the factory, they hurriedly went forward to respectfully greet them. The 2 senior men whispered into their ears. They each nodded as they listened to their orders, and then walked toward the minefield with their guns drawn. Watching them go, The two masked men exchanged a high five before heading back into the factory. Suddenly, everyone inside the factory got moving. Under the command of the man in the vampire mask, they began to set up the ultimate checkpoint for tonight's exciting game. James continued to make swift and steady progress through the minefield. He walked bent at the waist, holding his rifle in both hands. He glanced up to see that he was less than 200 feet away from the factory. At that instant, intense pain suddenly spread across his skin. This was a strong internal warning that he was about to come under serious attack. Without even thinking about it, he ducked and crawled into a sheltered space nearby. The moment he dropped to the ground, a grenade flew his direction and exploded 15 feet away. Shards of shrapnel whistled in the night sky. Waves of hot air and dirt splashed over James's body. James instantly knew what had happened. Someone threw a grenade. Once again, the group had changed the rules of the game right in the middle of play. No, James thought. To be more precise, this group of lunatics has no rules to begin with. Their only pursuit was the joy and excitement of torturing people to death. Their nature was so twisted that they could no longer be called human. To them, rules were nothing but a joke. Hearing people approaching from both the left and right sides of the minefield, James kept his head down. They seemed to be trying to intentionally trigger the minefield explosives or force James to run and detonate them himself, whatever it took to prevent him from passing through the minefield unscathed. The first grenade had been a test, thrown into the field in an attempt to trigger more mines to explode. Under the dark cloak of night, it seemed that these new players couldn't remember where they buried their explosives, so they could only randomly probe. Two more grenades were tossed into the field, one from the left side and one from the right, both exploding not far from James. Neither their aim nor their luck seemed to be very good, for they still didn't manage to trigger any of the mines to explode. Instead, they lost track of James. With his super sharp hearing, James knew exactly where these new players were. James slithered silently through the grass, his gun strapped to his back, slowly heading towards the ones on the right. On the right side of the minefield, two men wearing masks were whispering to each other, trying to figure out where James had disappeared to all of a sudden. They were also trying to remember where they buried their explosives earlier that day. The man in the rooster mask laughed and said, "I do remember that area right ahead of him is littered with explosives. Perfect, right? He'll think he's about to reach the end of the minefield." The other man, wearing a wolf mask, grinned and said, "Then let's launch a few more grenades at him and flush him out. He'll head for the finish line straight through the sea of explosives. How exciting is that?" Before Wolfman could casually toss the grenade in his hand, he looked in the direction of the cracking sound he just heard. He was surprised to see that the neck of the man in the rooster mask next to him looked broken. Rooster Man fell straight down, revealing a man holding a black gun who'd been standing right behind him. "Oh, crap." Wolfman stared at the rifle. He paused for a moment, then turned around and fled toward the factory. Nobody had warned the masked grenade-throwing men that James had a gun. Wolfman howled in terror. The sudden scream was especially ear-piercing in the quiet night. It attracted the attention of everyone outside of the factory, including the two other masked men on the left side of the minefield. James wasn't in a hurry to shoot Wolfman. He suddenly stood up. His cold gaze wasn't on Wolfman, screaming and running away. Instead, his sharp eyes were looking at the men on the opposite side of the minefield. The moment James had stood up, two grenades were thrown at him. James's vision was as sharp as an eagle's, and he locked on to the two incoming grenades. In the same instant, he knelt on one knee, raised his rifle, and took aim. He decisively pulled the trigger, and two precise shots rang out. The muzzle of the gun flashed. Two hot bullets flew out of the barrel and turned into a line of fire slicing through the night sky. The shots accurately hit their targets. the 2 grenades flying in the air towards James. The grenades exploded in midair, lighting up the sky. Shrapnel flew in all directions. James heard the 2 men on the opposite side of the minefield cry out in agony. The sound was especially horrifying in the desolate wilderness of the dark night. James didn't bother to shoot them directly. The grenades had exploded at such close range to them that the shrapnel had done the job for him. If the 2 men weren't treated within the next 10 minutes at most, they'd soon turn into cold corpses thanks to all the blood they were losing. James refused to put them out of their misery because he felt that people as evil as they are should suffer. Right after detonating the 2 grenades in midair, James turned the rifle on Wolfman, running frantically toward the factory. Bullets flew from the barrel of the gun, followed by flames shooting out from the muzzle. But the bullets didn't hit the escaping Wolfman. Instead, they shot up the grass on his right. Bullets were flying everywhere, spitting up flying debris that painfully pierced Wolfman's body. Indescribable fear forced him to deviate from his current route that bypassed the minefield. His nerves were frazzled, and in his panic, he rushed straight into the minefield in front of the finish line. Watching this, James revealed a cold smile. This was precisely his plan. He wanted to use Wolfman to clear the minefield. That was a much better use of the man than simply killing him. James also knew quite well that his every move was being watched by his opponent, so he planned to use the smoke and dust from the explosions to obscure his whereabouts. James speculated that his main opponents were likely hiding in the abandoned factory. Although James had no idea what else they may have up their sleeves, he felt that the minefield was the most important turning point in the game tonight. He wasn't foolish enough to let them lead the way from beginning to end. Now was the right time for James to take the initiative. There was one thing he deeply understood. If he waited for the Black Bat Society to tell him over the phone how to play the 5th stage, by then it would be too late. Help! Wolfman was still running for his life through the most treacherous section of the minefield. The next second, Wolfman stepped on a mine. His entire body was sent flying by the huge heat wave. His call for help was abruptly cut short. That explosion set off a chain reaction in the minefield. Countless explosives buried underground were set off. The air was suddenly filled with dirt, smoke, and flames. Although the explosion was intense, it only lasted for a short while. As soon as the smoke filled the sky, James rushed forward and disappeared into the dark cloud. Vampire Man watched James disappear from the screen. His expression immediately darkened. He's gone! Since the establishment of the Black Bat Society, this was the first time he'd encountered a formidable foe. It was also the first time that he'd ever felt truly worried and afraid. He suddenly swiveled and grabbed his pistol on the table behind him. He snapped the magazine into place and grinned. Okay, everyone, he's here. Let's go and greet him. The sound of men and women cocking their own weapons rang across the room. Guns fully loaded, they walked quickly toward the setting for the 5th stage that they'd so carefully prepared. Thanks to Wolfman clearing the way, James crossed the finish line at the edge of the minefield without incident. Rather than head straight for the factory, he moved horizontally under the cover of smoke. From there, he watched the activity surrounding the factory. James confidently pulled the trigger, taking down all of the masked men guarding the outside of the factory with unimaginable speed and accuracy. Vampire Man and his group had just stepped out of the front door of the factory. Hearing gunshots ringing out, Vampire Man stopped in his tracks. He defensively crouched down and his companions followed suit. Nobody dared to continue forward. The situation had suddenly changed. The strength and cunning of this player had far exceeded any of their expectations. It was as if they'd completely lost control of the game they designed. Vampire Man waved his hand and the group hastily retreated behind a nearby bunker, seeking cover, trying to get their bearings. There were no monitors or gaming devices outside the factory at the Vampire Man's disposal, which made him feel vulnerable, helpless. And just like that, James and the vampire man, separated by the gate to the factory, formed a momentary and uneasy ceasefire. After James finished off all of the masked guards and confirmed that no one had escaped, he cautiously approached the gate to the factory. Suddenly, he clenched his fists, and his eyes turned blood red. He was there to rescue Cindy, but through the factory gate, he saw that at that moment, Cindy was in an extremely bad situation. She was strung in the air by a thick rope. Her mouth was gagged with a cloth, and her face was pale as a sheet. Clearly, Cindy was terrified. That wasn't even the worst of it. The most alarming thing James saw was a huge cauldron filled with oil bubbling a few feet below her dangling feet. Beneath the pot, a fire burned with raging flames, causing the oil inside the pot to boil over the side. The far side of the rope was attached to a sturdy-looking bunker situated next to the factory. James didn't need to guess who the mastermind was behind all of this, and who was controlling the rope from behind the bunker right then. Only members of the Black Bat Society could devise such a cruel game. James quickly assessed how extremely bad the situation was. If he made even the slightest mistake, a living person would be fried in oil. He couldn't let that happen. James had come all this way and expended such heroic efforts to get to this point. It wasn't all to save some deep-fried college beauty. He needed to save Cindy in one piece. For the first time that night, James felt a headache coming on strong. James quickly realized that despite this threatening situation, Cindy didn't yet appear to be hurt, which made him feel slightly better. As an unfortunate consequence of seeing Cindy in such immediate peril, James completely lost the initiative he'd been building. His temporary paralysis allowed control of the game to be suddenly and unintentionally passed back to the Black Bat Society. Sure enough, his phone rang again. This time, James was prepared. He switched the phone to vibration mode. He had no intention of answering. When Vampire Man realized that James wasn't going to answer, he felt impatient and frustrated. After all, they weren't like James, who went head-to-head with pirates and world-class assassins. Their strength and endurance wasn't evenly matched. After about 2 minutes of silence, Vampire Man loudly and arrogantly said, "My dear super player, I know you're watching quietly outside the factory gate. Sorry to tell you, but that gate is the only way in. And this is the last game I've prepared for you. Ultimate rescue, life and death." Vampire Man continued, "It all comes down to luck. I'll count to 3, then ignite the rope holding your friend. If you can save her before the rope burns through, I'll give you 1,000 euros as a reward for winning the game. Of course, again, it all depends on your luck." Vampire Man laughed cruelly. "My dear super player, you've given us too many surprises tonight. Good luck." Following the arrogant laughter, he started counting. 1, 2. James thought he could hear their excited and heavy breathing coming from the other side of the bunker, even though he was still on the opposite side of the factory gate. 3. James saw one end of the rope yank Cindy up. With a loud boom, a flame instantly rose from the other end of the rope. "Monsters!" James tightly clenched his fists. Hanging in midair, Cindy grew even more frightened by this sudden escalation and fought to get free. How could she not be terrified? As she struggled, the gag in her mouth came loose and dropped straight into the boiling pot. When the cloth hit the oil, it was incinerated in an instant, producing a horrific crackling sound. Cindy let out a hysterical scream. The fear was overwhelming. Because the strength of the burning rope was becoming more tenuous, she should have tried not to struggle. Instead, she fought even more intensely. The situation quickly grew even worse than James had imagined. At the top of the gate, he saw 2 thin wires. They were clearly 2 cereal grenades planted there. Although James considered this a crude line of defense, coupled with all the other difficulties he was currently facing, this could prove to be a fatal obstacle for his rescue of Cindy. Hearing the cracking sounds of the burning rope, James knew that there was little time left. His brain instantly switched into computer mode, quickly processing various factors and unexpected scenarios in his mind. Then he leaned forward and rushed toward the factory gate at alarming speed. The wires at the top of the gate were crossed diagonally, so it would be impossible for James to jump over them or crawl beneath. And he estimated that the wires were connected to at least 4 grenades, so he couldn't pull them apart. But there was a triangular gap between the wires near the doorframe. Although the gap was small, James had already calculated that he could fit through it. The moment he got close to the gate, he jumped through the gap like a salmon swimming upstream and passed through to the other side. He landed and rolled forward, quickly forming a kneeling posture. He raised his gun and fired at the bunker. He wanted to put them on the defensive as quickly as possible, to make them afraid to even show their faces. There was no turning back now. As soon as James had embarked on this exceptionally difficult rescue mission, he didn't even have a second to waste. The rifle in his hand spewed out long flames. The bullets created a safety net in front of him. Even though Vampire Man had expected James to rush in, he'd never expected him to be so fierce. The Black Bat Society members didn't dare to leave cover of the bunker. Since they remained hiding behind it, they couldn't see everything that was happening outside. That led to some wild speculation as to who was shooting at the bunker. Was it a person, a group of people? Had the police finally caught up to them? Or was it James? That last thought made them shudder. While Vampire Man's eyes still shone with excitement, some of his teammates longed to retreat to safety.